Hi,
Perfect.
Marina.
I'm recording now, Monica.
Okay, great. Um, well, it's really great to see all of you. I think I know a lot of you guys. And yeah, I'm so grateful to Paul for organizing this event today. Namazakes. I think most of you guys know what namazakes are. I'll talk a little bit about what they are, but it's a time of the year that I really look forward to, and I think most of what comes into the US, because these products are so fragile and they're so susceptible to oxidation and bacterial contamination, most of the inventory that we bring into the US is really earmarked for restaurants. And in this time where people can't go to restaurants, we were really scared that we were going to have all of this namazake and nowhere to send it, and there is such a short shelf life for it. But we're very lucky to have these diehard namazake evangelists like Paul and Russell, who I see on the call as well, who I know has been selling quite a bit of namazake in Seattle, to the point where I think Paul has actually sold out of all of his namazakes. So I'm really excited to enjoy these with you. And I think that I was just talking to Paul that what he's doing right now is so special and so necessary. I think that we're all getting a little tired of our routine, being stuck at home, and we have our go-to recipes and our go-to beverages that we like to drink, and it starts to get really boring. And as the future looks so uncertain, it makes it that much more attractive to have an experience curated for you. And Paul is so thoughtful in the way that he writes about these sakes and how he wants them to be enjoyed. So I'm really excited to conduct tonight a little more of in a discussion manner. And I think it's a small enough group where I think we can all get involved. Because of the feedback, if you can stay muted when you're not speaking, that would be really helpful. But I don't know if anyone here is new to Zoom, but there is a chat function. So I have the chat box open here, and I'll be keeping an eye on it. So if you have a question or you'd like to chime in with your impressions of what we're drinking, please feel free to either unmute yourself and chime in, or chime in via the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye on that the whole time. I'm also very excited to have a special guest with us tonight. We are tasting 4 different Japanese namazakes, and we'll be finishing with the Rihaku for several reasons. But the president and Toji of Rihaku is joining us tonight, Mr. Yuichiro Tanaka. He has his camera on, so if you are looking through the grid of people's photos, you can see him, and he'll be talking to us about Rihaku after we kind of prime our palates with the first 3 sakes, because I think this one is definitely the most complex. And if you are, I know Paul sent out an email this morning saying, of course, don't feel like you need to open all 4 namazakes. If you would like to, please do. They stay open. Sake stays open a lot longer than wine. And so you can continue to enjoy them for a lot longer than you might think.
Yeah, I like to say with the namazake, they can often get better within the next 6 to 12 hours, or even 24 hours, and then you might start to see some degradation over the next couple of days. So certainly, if you want to commit to drinking wonderful sake over the next 2-3 days, go ahead, open them all and enjoy.
So just as a little refresher for everyone here who might be new to namazake or just want a little reminder on what they're drinking, namazake is there are some year-round namazakes, but this kind of springtime nama is what we'll be talking about today, which is a very seasonal time to drink sake in Japan. Before, sake was not commercially distributed in Japan until the 1990s, and so before that, everyone kind of waited for this time of year in the late winter, early spring, where not only is the snow beginning to thaw, but sake breweries are rounding up their season, and you can kind of get a little taste of what's to come. Most sakes do after this late winter, early spring period. They spend 6 months to a year maturing and evolving, and what you'll find at the end of the summer, early fall, is much more of a round, settled, complex version of these sakes. But it is a really exciting time of year where you can have these very lively, brash, youthful sakes, and they are very delicate products, and we do a pre-sale every year because we want these sakes to spend as little time in transit as possible. So it's important for us to be able to let our brewers know before the end of the prior year what we're going to be ordering, so that they can time their production schedule, so that all of these 4 producers are finishing production of their namas at the same time, bottling them at the same time, so it can go right to being cargo ready. And then as soon as they hit our warehouse, we ship them out. So we really want to minimize that time as much as possible, so that you can experience them in the way that the producer intended for them to be experienced. As Paul said, these rules are all meant to be broken. So there is a interesting, there's a very interesting quality that happens when namazakes do oxidize and mature, and these are all things that you can play around with. But we are very fortunate to have these very fresh right now. So I just have this aroma and flavor wheel up here that I'll keep going back to. I have a little slide that dives deeper into each brewery as we're tasting, but I think that it's helpful to have this up here, especially if you don't taste a lot of sake, and you might be a little intimidated to use the lexicon of aromas and flavors that you might use in wine. The sake lexicon is very different. And one of the things that I like to point out, especially as we're tasting namas, is that I think you'll find a very varying presence of dairy in each namazake, which is a very, it's a very common aromatic and flavor component for namazakes. And so that doesn't always exist in wine. So I think it's important to kind of think about the dairy, if it's there, and what you're getting. And then also the cereal and grain. I think people hesitate to describe the steamed rice aromas on sake, because I think they feel like it's like saying a wine smells like grapes. But there really is a lot of different, varying amount of cereal and grain notes as we taste the sake. So I'm very excited. I'm excited to have Tanaka-san here, and we will dive right in. So the first sake that I'd like to taste is the Taka. It's the rainbow label right here. So I just have some pictures from the brewery as we go through here. Just to talk about Taka a little bit. Taka is a producer from Yamaguchi Prefecture. Yamaguchi is very famous for a sake brewery called Desai that I think everyone on this call has probably had, if you guys all care enough about sake to spend your Saturday afternoon or evening with Paul and myself. Very famous sake producer, but not that this is anything bad, but they make sakes that are quite commercial in style. Their sakes are all about consistency, being very appealing to a novice drinker. And Taka, as I was saying, premium sake wasn't commercially distributed until the early 90s. And before that, so it took until the 80s really for the quality of sake to be exciting and good enough to warrant all the trouble that it takes to circulate it throughout the country. And so Taka is the 4th generation owner of his family business. And when he was realizing that he was going to inherit the sake brewery, he was not very excited about this. He thought that sake was commercial and kind of boring and didn't have any soulfulness. And it wasn't a very prestigious or very kind of sexy thing to do, to be running a sake brewery. And it wasn't until he had a glass of Chablis at this wine bar in Yamaguchi that I guess spoke to him so much that he just decided to leave for Burgundy, not speaking any English or any French, and with a map kind of driving around and knocking on doors of wineries that he respected. And I think people were so amused and confused by his by how crazy he was that they let him in. And so he ended up spending a couple of years between Burgundy and Alsace apprenticing with some really amazing winemakers, and he returned home ready to take over the brewery. And he was the first generation of his family to insist on being the brewmaster as well as the president of the brewery. And he really wanted to make sake through the lens of a winemaker. And so what that means in the glass is it's really hard to talk about Taka without talking about limestone. And I think that the concept of terroir is incredibly controversial when it comes to sake, because you can drink a sake like Desai, which doesn't have any minerality. And then you can drink a sake like Taka, which is full of this limestone. And so it's really up to the brewer and what they want to show. But terroir is something that's very important to him. And so near the brewery is Akiyoshidai, which is the longest limestone cave in Japan. It's 9 kilometers long. And water, his water source is water cascading over these limestone plates that you can see in the top left-hand corner. These are actually naturally created limestone plates, and they drain into a river running alongside the brewery. And so every stage of sake making, you add water. And so that limestone is influencing the water in the making of sake, but also he decided, when he took over the brewery, he decided he wanted to grow his own rice. And so his rice paddies are also being nourished by that limestone rich water, which I think that you get on the nose and on the palate. So we'll go back to this aroma wheel as we're tasting together. So I totally agree. I think that this sake has a lot of cucumber. Cucumber, melon, there are various types of melon here. I think we're definitely getting some of these ginjo aromas, green melon, watermelon. I think that the limestone, that kind of pavement after the rain note, even comes out on the nose. There's some citrus here, lemon, lime, mint. Mint is a very intense aromatic and flavor that I get from Taka, especially on the finish. It has that really lifted, cooling menthol quality. And I think that, and Mark, the yeast that Taka uses in their sake, he uses yeast number 9 in all of his sakes. It's part of his philosophy on having this domain concept where there's a continuity between all of his sakes. And so he really likes working with yeast number 9 because it gives you good acidity and good aroma that's not ostentatious. And so, you know, with the minerality in the water, I think that it does give a little more tension and energy to the sake. And then being nama, if you have this in the pasteurized version, the fruit is much more quiet. This is like having the volume turned up on those botanicals and fruit notes.
I definitely get the hardness of the water on the finish. I get this like sort of salted plum is the way I describe my tasting note here. You want to talk a little bit about just hard water versus soft water?
Yeah, I love that salted plum umeboshi tasting note. I totally get it. It's yeah, it's really delicious. It's very, I mean, it's drying. So it's interesting. If you are tasting along with us, we're going to taste the fukucho next, and which is a really great opportunity to talk about hard versus soft water, because the Taka unmistakably is the hardest water in this lineup, and the fukucho is going to be the softest. So sake is 80% water, right? We add water at every stage of production. So depending on, and this really goes back to, it really depends on what the brewer wants to show in his or her sake. Depending on how much they filter the water and strip the minerals before they use it in production, that water may or may not be a very, very clear representation of what the local water is like. And for a long time, the idea, the concept with sake making is that these very beautiful, gorgeous ginjo, feminine styles of sake are made best with soft water, because the minerality in the water can accelerate fermentation. And so in terms of really trying to stress out the yeast in a classic ginjo production way, minerality in water is going to make that more challenging. But I think that as sake wants to exist more in the world of wine, the importance of having good acid structure has become much more of a priority with sake brewers. And for a long time, acidity just went hand in hand with umami. And so the ways that you would create acidity in sake would kind of make it difficult to have these ginjo aromas. And so a sake like this Taka that we're having that has this ginjo purity but still has really good acidity, that style didn't really exist. And so as people are embracing harder water and not taking those steps to strip the water of the minerality, I think that these really interesting, lean, racy styles of more ginjo-driven sakes are coming out, which I really enjoy. And I like both styles quite a bit, but it's interesting to see how the attitude towards what kind of water is best for making ginjo sake is changing. So I'd like, for those of you who are drinking the fukucho, I'd like you guys to pour some of the fukucho. And this is, we have Marcus Pakizer on the call today, who's the director of Sake for Young's Market. And I know that both Marcus and I are huge fans of this producer and the woman behind it. She's a personal and professional hero of mine. for many reasons. So Miho Imada is one of the only female Toji master brewers in Japan, and she's also the president owner of her brewery. And that's really not why Fukucho's amazing sake. I think that, you know, some people in the industry might say that she gets attention because she's a woman, but I think that her sakes are undeniably exuberant and complex and just so hard to forget. And this is the sake brand that I think has just really changed a lot of people's minds, in my experience, who might think that sake doesn't have the complexity or intensity or persistence that wine does, and thinking that because sake is low acid, it can't have the same balance as wine. This is a sake that it's really hard to make that argument once you try it. So Fukucho, some interesting things about this region. This region of Hiroshima, Akitsu, is known as the birthplace of ginjo, and which isn't just a marketing term. So sake was born, the sake making began in Kyoto. And when in this region of Akitsu, Hiroshima, the water is so soft that they had to kind of change the recipe of sake making. And there was a very iconic sake brewer, Senzaburo Miura, whose brewery was literally right behind Imada Shuzo, where they make Fukucho, who really identified the way to stress out the yeast and make control the fermentation so that the sake aromas would just jump out of the glass. And so I think this is her flagship style in the sense that it's so aromatically pronounced. The pasteurized version, if you can ever get your hands on it to do a comparison, the pasteurized version is only pasteurized once in bottle, and so it's really quite vibrant. And so when we first decided to bring in the sake as a namazake, I had some concerns that it wouldn't be different enough, because when you taste the pasteurized version, it's so juicy. But I think it's really complex, and I think that normally in the pasteurized version, I wouldn't describe the sake as having a savory quality, but there are just so many layers here. I think that the pineapple is the first thing that jumps out to me. And then this has more of a dairy component than the taka to me. There's more of a pineapple yogurt. And it's more intensely floral, more of this blossom, lily, rose. I always get violet on the nose of the sake.
I definitely get the purple fruits. There's really nice thickness to it, right? Almost like a pulpy pineapple. So it is really enjoyable.
Yeah, and I think on the palate, you can feel that softness. There's definitely, if you think back to that salted plum, umeboshi plum finish on the taka with the mint and the salt, this is so velvety, I think, in comparison. And it's interesting, if you're looking at the ABV, this is a full percent alcohol higher, the Fukucho is, than the taka, and this is actually bottled Genshu strength. There's no water dilution, and she uses a Hiroshima yeast that at the end of fermentation, where all fermentable sugars are converted into alcohol, it is 16.5. But it doesn't, despite the fact that it's not, and velvety might be the wrong term, because namas generally are a little more chewy. They have a candied, chewy quality, but I think compared to taka, we don't have the minerality on the palate at all. I think it's quite soft. And even though it's technically a nama genshu, it's really quite gentle, I think, on the palate compared to what other nama genshus express themselves as.
And Monica, with this soft water, does that mean that fermentation takes longer because it doesn't have as many minerals in the fermentation?
Yes, and there are a lot of things that make the fermentation take longer. I mean, there's the way that you make your koji, and how much food that you provide for the yeast to eat. There's the type of yeast that you select. There's the size of tank, the temperature of fermentation. So just the soft water doesn't equal long fermentation, but it really, if you really want to have a sake where there's nothing that gets in the way of the purity and the ginjo aroma, soft water is a great choice. Does anyone have a preference so far between the taka and the fukucho?
You just have to put that one in the chat there.
I think they're so different. I mean, when I go back to the Taka, it's really spicy, which I really like. I like that kind of tongue prickling spice on the finish and that the racy acid. But I think I would be more excited to play around with food pairings with the Fukucho, because I think the Fukucho is going to continue to evolve in the glass. Exactly, it's like Chablis or Merceau. But
Cool. I love it. I love how the richness of it. I love the feel on the palate, and I think that makes it really versatile with foods. Um, this type of thing is wonderful with pork. Things that have maybe some mouth coating fats to them. This can really work with that sort of thing. Whereas when you have mouth coating fats, I think that can be difficult with wines or other types of beverages.
yeah, I think it's really impressive to me. I've been experimenting with the Fukucho lately with some funkier cheeses, more in the creamy, like taleggio kind of funk, or like a really creamy blue cheese. And the umami in this nama really, like, it's almost hiding until you pair it with something where it needs to step up and rise to the challenge. And it's really interesting to see the evolution.
Yeah, as many of you all know on the call, I love pairing sake with cheese together. Why does that work, Monica? Why? I mean, I love it, but why does it work?
Well, it works for several reasons. I mean, with sake, all sake has lactic acid, right? So you need lactic acid to create an environment that's acidic enough for sake yeast to be able to propagate and for wild yeast and bacteria uh, to not be active. And so cheese is all about lactic acid as well. And I've been I've been making cheese lately because I'm really bored in this quarantine. And so I've been studying cheese science and food science as it relates to cheese, and thinking about you know cheese can be more acidic than sake in a lot of ways. The citric acid can be really pronounced in certain sakes, but so I think that the acid and the citric acid, well, sake doesn't have citric acid, but sake acids and then the lactic acid, that texture, that range of creaminess to more kind of nutty, aged in sake and cheeses. There's so many ways that they parallel each other, and I think that a lot of cheese pairings with wine are very challenging. I've always, if I wasn't drinking sake with cheese, I would go with beer or sherry. But I think with wine, the tannins and the wine acids really get in the way. And so there's something, so like a lot of sake pairings are about harmony, and either taming or enhancing certain characteristics in a food. And so cheese, and that is just a perfect representation of the harmony, I think, between both. And it's a great way to entertain. You can open up 4 sakes and 4 cheeses and close them and put them back in the fridge, and they're fine for quite a while. And so I think it gives you a lot of room to play around as well.
I also think too, a lot of cheeses have a fair bit of salt, and of course, salt is such a wonderful friend of sake. So the salt can often unlock some of the savory characteristics of the sake.
Totally. And I think about cheese pairing sometimes in the way that you would make a cheese plate. So if you would do some sort of compote, you would think about what fruit would be in that compote and think about those aromatics. What brings to mind those aromatics in a sake that you know? Or if you want to do honey with a cheese, I think something that has more of an oxidative characteristic, kind of a smoky honey note, goes really well with that kind of cheese. And so I think the way that you would compose a cheese board is a good baseline for how you would thoughtfully select a sake pairing. So the way that I wanted to organize the progression of these 4 sakes was starting with the 2 that are more fresh and fruity, and then going into more savory and slightly more complex. So the next sake that we're going to taste is the Amanoto, Heaven's Door. Paul will not be joining us for the Amanoto because he's unfortunately sold out, which I'm sad about, because Paul really gave me the best tasting notes for this Amanoto. So this is an interesting namazake, and one that I really love, because namazake, some people like to dismiss namazake as all being really like yogurty and green apple and candied, and this is very much not that. It's a very grain-driven namazake, which makes a lot of sense if you think about this brewery. So this brewery was the first true grower producer in Japan. These guys started out as rice farmers in Akita, which is a really highly regarded area for sake rice. And they were very passionate about growing rice, and they wanted to make the sake themselves. And so this philosophy of, you know, seed managing, the same people managing the sake from the seed all the way to the bottle was not very common in Japan. It's very different trades from brewing to farming, and there's quite a bit of seasonality with both of these trades. And so these guys were the first real kind of farmer sake brewers. And the Toji Moriya-san was really legendary, and there hadn't been many Tojis at this brewery. They recently just celebrated their 100-year anniversary, so it's not a very old brewery. And the Toji unfortunately passed away last year of a pulmonary embolism, but he collapsed in his own rice field, which feels very kind of poignant. And so they are they're very committed to regionality and reflecting Akita style in their sakes. They work with a Akita rice that in all of their rice fields are visible from the front door of their brewery, and they work with a proprietary Akita yeast, and everyone who works there is from Akita. And so rice is going to be something, I think all of their sakes have a ricey note that is very interesting. And in this, if we go back to the aroma and flavor wheel here, I think you'll see more of like, Paul makes a lot of pizza, so I really like his pizza references. And like there really is kind of a sourdough or like salty pizza crust note on this sake, which I think you said in the pasteurized form has more of a like peanut quality. And I think that the in the Nama version, it's more malty. There's more of that toasted cereal, but it's still quite floral to me. I think it has a lot of like dried flowers, baking spice, certainly nutmeg, clove, white chocolate. But I think what the core of what the sake is about is really that grain-driven style, porridge and toasted cereal.
And this year too, I get a fair bit of pear, like maybe canned pear or pear extract, kind of syrupy pear notes that give it a really, really nice texture, and again make it really food friendly. You know, one of the things I always think about is the texture of these sake when I'm thinking about how to pair them and what to eat them with. The thicker the texture, I think the more freedom you have, and these more thick grain driven things are always great with lots of different foods, because you're not trying to preserve that really ginjo aromas or things like that, because it plays on a little bit really yellow green side of your spectrum over here. There's lots of things that we eat in those spectrums pretty often, and so you have a lot of freedom to pair these sakes.
Yeah, I definitely get baked pear now that you say it, especially in the texture as well. And what I really like with this sake is vinegary foods, especially pickled foods. The Toji was also a really amazing chef, and he made the best narazake or sake leaves, pickles made with sake leaves that I've ever had. And I was doing a Zoom seminar yesterday with some of our Vegas sommeliers, and the staff, the beverage team behind the David Chang's restaurants in Vegas. They say that this sake is the only sake that they pair with kimchi with confidence. And we were doing a little bit of a kimchi tasting along with it, and it really works. And so I think that what we always end up doing, and even I do this, and is assuming that the sake doesn't have what it takes to stand up with the food, and it's not until you take a risk and try something like sake with kimchi, or sake with, pickled garlic, or just something that's so extreme. That's the only way to know. And I think I find myself pleasantly surprised. I think that it's very unique to have a beverage like this that has the alcohol to give it the structure to stand up to a lot of strong flavors, but the alcohol doesn't create too much heat when you pair it with something like kimchi. There's this very generous texture to sake, and having the lack of tannins and the lack of strong acids really helps it create harmony while still having a lot of sturdiness and grip. Is anyone drinking the sake right now? What do you guys think? All right, well, we can go back to it. I want to introduce Tanaka-san here. It's 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan, so he's being very agreeable. Can everyone see Tanaka-san here? It's a Yuichiro. He's got some blinds behind him. So Yuichiro Tanaka, he is the president and Toji of Rihaku Brewery. Rihaku is from Shimane Prefecture. Shimane is, so Japan's divided into 47 prefectures. They're kind of like states. And Tanaka-san always says that Shimane is the second least populated prefecture in Japan, which makes it a boring place to visit, kind of, but probably a great place for agriculture because there aren't all these humans to get in the way. And I talk to Tanaka-san quite often. He's compared to our other sake breweries, he's very he worked on many sides of this industry. He is he's our only brewer who's worked in sake distribution in Japan, as well as being a brewer. And he, like Taka and like Fukucho, performs both roles of master brewer and president of the brewery. So I think he has a nice balance of passion and understanding the economic side of the business. And so he gives me a lot of advice. And I'm very excited to be able to offer this sake for many reasons. So Tanaka-san, as you can see from looking at him, he's a very young man to be both the master brewer and the president of his company. And he was put into this role at a very young age. His father, unfortunately, passed away far too soon. And so right around when he was turning 30, I think, is when he became the president of his brewery. And there was so much pressure put on him to uphold the legacy that his father had created. And so Rihaku as a house style, there's something very comforting as a house style. They use a lot of yeast number 9, which gives you a lot of isoamyl-acetate. There's kind of this very familiar sense of banana characteristic on most Rihaku sakes. Their sakes are very well balanced, and they're not, there's kind of an old school comforting quality about them in the sense that they're not high tone, they're not super exuberant, they're not going to get in the way of your food. And of course, he took it very seriously that it was his job to uphold this legacy, but he also really felt like he had his own voice to express in terms of the sake that he made. And so this sake, I feel like sometimes when I explain it, it sounds like he's being so rebellious, but it really is in a very respectful way. He wanted people to know that this is a departure from the Rihaku house style, and it also is a style that his father probably would never have embraced. This sake is made with omachi rice, and so you guys being sake fanatics and being on this Zoom probably have had some omachi rice, which is surprising because omachi rice is actually less than 4% of all sake rice that's grown, but it's one that has a pretty cult following in sake lovers because it has a very idiosyncratic quality to it. There's a smoky, herbaceous characteristic. There's a richness to omachi that for people who love sake and want more from the sake, they don't just want these easy drinking, fresh and clean sakes. Omachi is soulful and it's complex and it continues to evolve in the glass, but it's a very difficult rice to work with. And you can see here on the top, on the very left here, we have koshikari rice strains all the way up to omachi on the very left. And so you can see the height as well as the weight. And so omachi is very tall and very heavy compared to other types of sake rice. Koshikari is the only table rice that you're seeing. And these are all sake rices. And omachi grows up to 140 centimeters and is kind of a finicky rice. You know, it generally, the only growing conditions that it seems to really like are Okayama, Japan, where almost every other rice has multiple regions that it grows very well in. And it's also a very difficult rice to actually brew sake with. Because of the shape and the softness of the grain, it's very difficult to polish this rice to a high level. But because if you guys have had omachi, you probably understand why people still insist on working with it, despite the fact that it's not the most accommodating rice. So Stephen, when I say high tone, I just mean like really aromatically intense, like very ostentatious, kind of in your face, very flashy aromas, which are extremely appealing on the first sip. They're a great aperitif sake. They're very impressive. I think of them as like Vegas sakes, you know, in these kind of shiny, sparkly luxury places. These daiginjos make a lot of sense, but I think they can get in the way of your dining experience. So Tanaka-san's father was never a fan of working with heirloom rice. And he thought that omachi was a little too idiosyncratic. Like you couldn't, like with omachi, the rice decides a lot about how the sake is going to taste. Where rice like Yamana Nishiki, the brewer decides what kind of sake they're going to make. That rice can adapt to so many different styles of sake. And so he knew that he wanted to make a sake with omachi, even though it wasn't maybe something that his prior generation had supported. And Tanaka-san went to the Tokyo, to the Nodai University, the Tokyo Ministry of Agriculture, which is kind of like the UC Davis of sake making. And he contributed to some postgraduate research about isolating yeast from flour yeast. And so for over 100 years, there's been a bit of a homogenization in sake yeast in Japan due to the Brewing Institute of Japan capturing these yeasts that have been isolated throughout the country and really normalizing them in a way that where the yeast would always behave in the same way. And you could always count on, if you use this yeast with this type of rice, this polishing rate, and you ferment in this way, you know you're going to have banana, or you know you're going to have melon. And so I think some brewers, like Tanaka-san, found this a little limiting in terms of what kind of aroma profile they could create. And so he really wanted to work with flour yeast. And it's so interesting how flour yeast refuses to adhere to any kind of typicity. What he uses for his sake is tsurubara, which is kind of like a climbing vine rosebud that I tried to find a picture of over here. And instead of, you might expect something really floral from using the flour yeast, but I think that the sake, and Paul has some great notes in here, it's not really the floral that jumps out at you. So I'm going to go back.
I think that what's interesting about it is with the omachi specifically, and I think you have to kind of divide the omachi flavors and the yeast flavors here. Because for me, the omachi flavors, I get savory, I get celery, and cold steel is one of the notes I always put on there. And on the fruity side of the omachi, I get blueberry flesh. I don't get the blue part of the blueberry. I get the yellow interior of the blueberry. And I think that comes through in the texture of this sake as well. So it's always fascinating to me, and I always love it because it's deeply complex on both a savory and a fruity side. And some of that is the rice coming through, whereas with some of the more popular rices like Yamada Nishiki, they're chosen because they grow really well and they polish really well, and they're pretty neutral, and so the brewer can make other decisions besides what the rice is.
Yeah, I think that's a good, I think that's a very, very thoughtful thoughtful feedback.
I'd love to hear from him if he's available to talk a little bit about working with the rice itself and the flour yeast.
田中さんいいですか？
はい。
マーカスからちょっと質問あるけれども、
はい。
花工房は境界工房より使いにくいと、あとはポールさんがもうちょっとなんかお町のこだわりとか、お町のお酒の作り方、どこで一番苦労してるとか、そういう質問なんですけれども。
聞こえてます？
はい。
まずは、工房は、もともとカプノン酸のちょっと出るタイプの酵母で、お町は溶ける米なので、溶けちゃうと酵母って弱りやすいんですよね。で、その酵母の、米の溶けと酵母の増えていくバランスっていうのを取るのがすごく、この酵母では難しいと思います。
So first, the flour yeast has a tendency to develop a lot of ethyl caproate, and so these kind of like what I was saying earlier is high tone, and the omachi as a rice is one that dissolves really quickly, and so so it can be hard to manage that multiple parallel fermentation of the, the rice dissolving at the same rate that the yeast is eating sugar and producing alcohol.
で、このお町を選んだ理由っていうのも、出雲杜氏ってすごくよく米を溶かす作り方をするので、うちに昔いた杜氏さんには多分この酵母とお町では美味しいお酒が作れないと思って、で、僕が全部その酒造りを、やるために杜氏さんたちに触らないで僕がやりますっていうためにわざと難しい組み合わせを選んで最初にこの組み合わせで始めました。
So he also wanted to clarify that it's not that he really wanted to work with omachi. It's that, so I think you guys, some of you might know about these regional toji guilds. And so in Shimane, the toji guild is the Izumo Toji Guild. And so they had a Izumo Toji before Tanaka-san took over the brewing. And that Izumo Toji, like from that regional guild philosophy, it was that a quick and they really do excel in managing the rate of the rice dissolving. And so these rice dissolving experts always said, well, omachi is never going to work with flour yeast. And so he really wanted to, without causing any rifts, to be able to kind of pick a sake that he would be managing. And so he knew that if he decided to make a sake with a rice like omachi that dissolves quickly and flour yeast that's not supposed to go together, that this Izumo Toji wouldn't want anything to do with it, and so it would be his project.
で、このお米ってそれまでの李白の酒造りは全部、機械でお米を洗ってることが多かったんですけど、このお米機械で洗っちゃうと、すごく短い時間で水を吸っちゃうので、まず米洗いを、全部手で洗うようにして、米洗うだけで3時間ぐらいかかっちゃうこともあるんですけど、そのあたりで他の人が触らないように。
So at the brewery, the other thing that he wanted to mention about what made it easy for him to for this to be his first project is that at the brewery for washing rice, they use a machine. And omachi, if you use a machine to wash it, it absorbs too much water, so it will dissolve quickly. And so it has to be done very carefully by hand. And that was just a lot of work, especially since the managing of the washing of omachi rice sometimes took 3 hours. And so he knew that would just be way too annoying for anyone else. And so he thought that would give him a good chance of taking over this project.
そんな感じでいいですかね。
素晴らしい。Paul, do you have any other questions?
Well, I was going to open it up. Does anyone have any questions for him about this wonderful sake? It's always, as I say, it's always one of my favorites. Every year I don't buy enough, and I run out of it. So next year, hold me to this, Monica. We're going to double down for next year.
Let's do it. Tanaka-san, この酒の組み合わせのおすすめとかはありますか？
なんだろうね。僕はいつも和食ばっかり考えるので、ちょっと甘めの味噌の味付けとかよく合うかなと思うんですけど、なんかそういう料理がありますかね。
So I just asked him to get things rolling if there's a food pairing that he recommends, and he said he's a really good cook. He cooks a lot, but he generally makes Japanese food, and he's always thinking about Japanese food. So he was saying a sweeter miso sauce would be really good with it, and I could definitely see that, like eggplant miso dengaku, or maybe like hindara saikyoyaki, or kind of a sweeter miso. And ちょっと水の説明もお願いします。
水は李白の、敷地内から出てます。で、軟水寄りの水なんですが、松江はすごく水が多いところで湖もたくさんあるんですけど、全部海水が混ざってるので、塩の混ざらない水ってすごく珍しくて、市内に3つ酒蔵があるんですけど、自分家の井戸が出てるのは李白だけですね、今は。そういう水を使ってます。
So I was asking him for Seth and Daniel's question. I was asking about the water, and he said that it is soft water that he uses, but this is actually quite unusual for Shimane because even though they do get a lot of soft water, there's a lot of ocean water because there's so many bodies of water around Shimane. And so there's a lot of ocean water that mixes with the soft water. And so to have water that doesn't have all of this ocean salt in it is very rare. And to have their own well within as their water source that they own, Rihaku is actually the only brewery in Shimane Prefecture.
松江ですね。松江プリフェクチャーで。
松江 City within Shimane.
はい。そんな感じでいいかしら。
とりあえずね、みんななんかこのお酒が一番気に入ってるってコメントで。
それは僕をごますってないですかね。
全然。
ありがとうございます。
I was going to ask, does he use any other yeasts besides this rosebud? Are there other yeasts that he's experimented with and found results with?
このつるバラ工房以外、
はい、
何使ってますか、工房について。
今アメリカに輸出してるのは全部9号ですよね。
でもワンドリングポエットは島根9号。
そう、島根9号。で、ドリーミークラウズは901。
了解。
あとはベゴニアの花工房っていうのを使ってますかね。あと出品種にアベリアの花工房。
ピーチの何？
出品種。出品種って
ベゴニア。
いや、アベリア。出品種はね。
アルベリア。
アベリアっていう、それも花工房。
So, as far as yeast that he uses, the Rihaku style is yeast number 9. And so we have 3 other Rihaku sakes that come into the US. And the Dance of Discovery and Dreamy Clouds are made with yeast 901 obtained by the Brewing Society. And then he uses a Shimane prefectural descendant of yeast number 9 for Wandering Poet, which is a little more high in aroma. And so if you taste Wandering Poet compared to the other ones, the green, like fruit and herbaceous notes are a little more pronounced, at least to me. And then he does, to Rochelle's question, he does work with other flower yeast for his competition sake. He uses a begonia yeast. And であとは麹作りについてちょっとハゼ回り、リハクのハゼ回り、月ハゼとかそうハゼ。
9号系は発酵力も強いんで、そこそこハゼ回らせるし、ハゼ込ませるように作ってます。で、お町に関してはあんまり一気に溶けると嫌なので、月ハゼになるように作ってます。
So as far as his koji making, he for the yeast number 9 sakes, because they promote a more vigorous fermentation than flower yeast, he's able to do more propagation of more high enzyme koji making. But for flower yeast, it really has to be very tsukihaze style with low enzyme.
で、お町はちょっと甘みも出したいので酵母とのバランスを考えて、でグルコースをちょっと多めに作る麹菌を使ってます。
Oh, sorry. でもお町が月ハゼって言ってましたよね。
お町月ハゼだけど麹菌の種類はグルコースが出る麹菌を使ってる。
So I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I was talking about flower yeast for the tsukihaze, but actually for omachi, he uses tsukihaze, but because he feels like those two go better together, but he also feels like having a little more glucose present is good for omachi. So even though it is tsukihaze, he uses a koji mold that produces more glucose, a yellow koji mold variety that produces more glucose for making the omachi. であとは発酵温度の質問が入ってきました。
発酵温度は、その時のその年の米の溶け具合、溶けない年は、どんどん 発酵が進んじゃうので低めにするし、溶けちゃった米を温度下げると途中で弱くなっちゃうので、そのバランスを見ながら、一番、25日から30日ぐらいで醸造できるようにして、その中で一番バランスのいい温度を選んで、発酵させてます。
じゃあ、すいません。じゃあ米が、
溶けると温度は高め、米が溶けなかったら温度は低め。
Okay. So it depends on the condition of the rice. If the rice can quickly dissolve, then 溶けやすい温度高め。
溶けやすい温度高め。
Okay, so if the rice can quickly dissolve, the temperature gets higher. And if the rice takes longer to dissolve, if it's a harder rice that won't dissolve, then the temperature goes lower. But generally, he tries to wrap up his fermentation in 23 days or so. でも大吟醸とかはもっと伸ばし
25から30。
Oh, 25 to 30 days, sorry. で、木本はやってますか？
木本もやってますね。木本は、それも温度低くしやすいんですけどね。酵母が強いんで。
So he does, for Seth and Danielle, he does do the old technique of kimoto as well. He experiments with that. And because that creates a more vigorous fermentation, 木本だったら米が溶けやすい。
酵母が強いから、ちょっと溶けてても温度下げても大丈夫。
Okay, so sorry. For Kimoto, because the yeast, the fermentation is going to be more vigorous, he can drop the temperature without worrying about a stuck fermentation.
ちなみにお町は、溶けすぎちゃうってうまく、コントロールできないと35日ぐらい、もろみ日数が長くなったこともあります。今年は28日だったかな。比較的思った通りにコントロールできていると思います。
So the omachi production, he wanted to say, by the way, sometimes tends to be the longest because if it dissolves too quickly, the fermentation could extend to 35 days to achieve the balance that should be achieved in 30 days.
I was going to ask, one of the other sake that we bring in is the nigori, and it's one of the nicer, better made nigori, I guess is what I would want to say. A lot of nigori in the US is not well made. They're not great, and his is. What does he like to pair that with?
いい質問ですね。クリーミークラウドはアメリカで出している濁り酒と比べるともうちょっとレベルが高いねってポールさんが言ってましたので、田中さんの組み合わせのおすすめは何ですか？
まず僕濁り酒がもともと好きじゃなくて、で、濁ってないお酒にちょっと濁りのいいところだけを取り入れた酒が作りたくて、ああいう、軽めの濁り酒を作ってるんですが、透明なお酒に味が比較的近い濁り酒だと思うんで、透明なお酒だと普通の濁ってないお酒だと、負けちゃうようなちょっとスパイシーな、胡椒とか、あとは唐辛子も少し効いても大丈夫なのかなと思うんですけど、ちょっと辛めなものでも、ドリーミークラウズだったら、合わせられると思いますね。
So Tanaka-san is very happy that you think so, Paul, and he said that the origin or the evolution of Dreamy Clouds and how it came to be is he does not like Nigori sake, and he wanted to create a sake that had some sort of validity in being a Nigori sake, and so he developed a sake that is very based on the nose and profile is very the attack and the finish and the structure is very similar to what you would experience with a clear sake, but he feels like maybe it has even more of a versatility than a clear sake, because where a clear sake might fail with like very spicy food or very peppery food, he feels like this sake can succeed. And so he would really like you to try it with spicier dishes, which I agree. I think it can. I've had it with some Szechuan food and it's been great. I also think it's really good with I had a bluefish pate that had a lot of like cream cheese. I think I had this with Tanaka-san in Santa Monica once. We had kind of this like bluefish dip with the sake and it was great. And I think it's a really nice tofu pairing as well. just texturally. Tanaka-san, is there anything that you would like to say to everyone here, or is that too big of a question? I know it's been a hard season for you with everything happening with the coronavirus and the new brewery being put on hold, and so I know that there are a lot of people here who really want to support you by drinking more of your sake. So Marina just had a question here about, are there any new projects that you're working on? Are there any new sakes that you're thinking about making?
You want to translate, Monica?
今なんか他の新しいこととか作るのを考えてますか？
あ、やっぱそういう話なのね。ごめんなさい。あんまり考えてないというか、新商品最近あんまり作ってなくて、とりあえず今あるものをどうやって、上手に作れるようになるかっていうのをずっとやってて、ただ最近ね、ドリーミークラウズの生酒を日本で始めて、これ本当は飲んでほしいぐらいすごくいいんですけど、面白いですよ。
美味しいね。So he because of kind of having to manage things, and Rihaku really has had a difficult season. They were in the process of building a new facility and moving into it, and they had to, due to everything drying up in Japan, they had to kind of stop construction. And so in terms of investing in making new sakes, that's not huge at the top of his list, but he does, he's really enjoying the Namazake version of the Dreamy Clouds, and I will attest it's really delicious. And so you might be seeing that sometime soon. And Nina, I sympathize. I know I thought I would never in my life tell people not to go to Japan, and I had a lot of friends that were planning to go in March and April, and I had to kind of advise them not to go, and it was heartbreaking, but I can't wait until we can all go. で、他の質問も入ってきましたけれども、はい、今年の作りの量はコロナウイルスを考えていろいろ変更しなきゃいけないことある。例えば注文の量が減ってくるからどうやってもっと長く寝かすのとか、在庫が減ってくるつもりとか。
一番近くだったリーマンショックの時に、5年ぐらい、ちょっとお酒が多くて困ったことがあって、多分今回それよりも余るのかなと思うんですけど、お米が12月にもう来年のお米を注文しちゃってるので、今もうそのお米が田んぼに行っちゃってるのでキャンセルできないんですよね。なので来年はたくさん作らなきゃいけなくて、その次の年から少しずつ減らして元に戻さなきゃいけないなっていうところですごく難しい問題だと思います。
でもたくさん作ったらばもっと長く寝かせるように冷蔵庫のスペースとか。
そうだね。一番難しいなと思ってるのは、今1年、18ヶ月とかぐらいで、1年分のお酒がなくなるように例えば作るとしたら、それが2年分できちゃうと普段よりも6ヶ月熟成が長くなるんですよね。でその味が、だんだん熟成されていくんで、お客さんは気づかずに飲むんですけど、ある年に元に戻すと急に新しい酒になったみたいになって、なんか今年はお酒おかしくないって言われたりするんですよね。
So, sorry, this is kind of a long answer, but he was saying that what's happening now, the closest in his time of being in business that he can think of was the stock market crash of 2008, and it took about 5 years to recover to the regular pace of production, both for domestic and export. And he feels like this time will probably be a harder hit. And unfortunately, I mean, he had already wrapped up the brewing season pretty much by the time that the COVID pandemic became a global pandemic. And in last you have to order rice for the upcoming production season the prior December. So December 2019, he had to order the rice for the brewing season that's going to start in October 2020. So he can't, that's already been like, there's already a farming production schedule, so you can't cancel that. So he's going to have to make what he planned to make. And he might try to restrict his production schedule in future years. But, you know, and so I asked him and this is something that I've been hearing from a lot of brewers is, you know, you have all this sake in the tank already that's ready to go now. And then you've bought all this rice for the future years. So how do you accommodate that? Like, do you figure out a way to age the sake where it's not going to be affected? And he said, well, it's never, you know, it's not going to not be affected. And so with the stock market crash, he was aging his sake maybe 6 months longer than he normally would, and people weren't really noticing until the economy recovered. And then all of a sudden people are like, what? The sake is so different because all of a sudden it's so much fresher. And so he's trying to figure that out. And obviously, you know, he has a legacy to uphold, and his family has been in business for a long time. And so you'd never do anything to cut any corners or jeopardize that name, so the family name. So it's going to be an interesting and challenging time coming forth. But Tanaka-san, everyone is responding in the chat saying that they will drink as much Rihaku as they can to support you. So I think that I really appreciate you getting up early on a Sunday morning during your Golden Week holiday to talk to us. And I wish that you were drinking sake with us, but I realize it's a little early. But we are all here and to support you. And I think that it really makes a difference to be able to connect with the person behind the sake. I know you don't make very much of this, and I know that it's very important to you to know where it's going. So hopefully this is good for you too. And thank you guys so much. If you guys have any other questions, we're still around, but we really appreciate it, and it's an honor to be able to open these bottles with you guys. And I think, you know, sake is all about community, and that's a lot of the reason that I got into this business. And it's about, you know, if you think about the rules with sake, it's about pouring for someone else, and, you know, and kampai, and really like enjoying these things together. And right now when we can't do it in real life, I'm very grateful to Paul for organizing this and for everyone. So please kampai, and I hope everyone is safe and healthy and has something delicious to eat with all these sakes tonight.
Yeah, enjoy. I hope you do. You've been doing lots of cooking, obviously, and keep it up. First of all, you don't have to leave. We're going to stay here and do lots of talking and answering any questions you all have. I did post in the chat as well any of the sake that I have left. So I've got a couple of nama left, and of course I've got the other two that we bring in from Rihaku, the Nagori that we were speaking about, as well as the Wandering Poet. So if you want to try those, send me an email, and we'll get you all hooked up with them. They're also really complex and wonderful sake. So thank you, Tanaka. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That's it. Monica, this is Sarah and Jonathan here in Philadelphia. We have a question for you.
Hi.
Hi. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. And it's great to finally meet you almost face to face.
No, we're getting closer.
Getting closer. This is something we talked with Paul about before, and we don't, and he doesn't. We don't have a strong handle on it. What do you think about the impact of travel on sake? I mean, it's pretty well known among people who buy wine from overseas that the effect of both air travel and long travel by boat, where the bottles are rocking, can cause what we call travel shock, or it can be boat goofy. So there's an impact of that travel on the taste of the sake for a while, and eventually it dissipates. It can be so pronounced that, for instance, we're hesitant to travel, to fly with high-end wine now because it just never shows very well. So we've noticed some things with sake that we've both taken on a plane and also brought over
by boat.
by boat that makes us wonder whether this is something that can impact sake as well. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Tanaka-san、このなんかワイン、ワイン業界でこのボトルショックとかよく話してますけれども、例えば海外からアメリカにワイン輸出するんだったらば、着いた時からちょっと落ち着くまで時間経たないとまた美味しさが戻ってこないとか、そういう考え方もいろいろあるけれども、宅急便で国内で送るときにも宅急便で送ったらば少しだけ落ち着くまで時間経った方がいいとか、そういう考えがよくワインの世界でよくあるけれども、日本酒はどう思いますか？
お酒の質によるのかなと思いますけどね。リハクはいつ飲んでも、そこそこ強い酒にしようとっていうのは輸出も一生懸命やっていこうと思ってるんで、あんまりお酒が、デリケートだとみんなに飲むのが難しいかなっていうのもあって、いつ飲んでもさっと飲んでも美味しいようにしたいなと思って作ってます。吟醸酒とかの香りがフルーティーなやつとか、ちょっと開けてから時間が経たないと美味しくならないやつとかもあると思いますけど、それぞれに見つけるしかないのかなって感じですよね。
でも大体しっかりしてるお酒はそんなに気にしなくてもいいので、もっとなんか酸味が低くて華やかなお酒はもうちょっと気をつけなきゃいけないっていうことですか？
そうですね。お酒によると思います。
So he feels like that it really depends on the sake, and in general, the more sturdy sakes that have really strong structure are great right when you open them. But he finds that very low acid, high aroma ginjo style sake, sometimes even after you open the bottle, you need to let it sit for a while before the sake condition is in its best possible shape. And also that applies to shipping sake as well. So like the kikuhime that you guys are bringing in, that is probably totally indestructible in terms of the acid structure and the umami. But if you're having a very opulent daiginjo style of sake, you might want to let that sit, open the bottle like an hour before you're planning on serving it. And if you are transporting it, you want to give it some time.
And Monica, by time, you mean like days, weeks, hours? How much time?
時間について、例えばなんか出品数を宅急便で送ったんだったらば、どのぐらい待ってた方がいい？
そんなに繊細に反応しないかなと思うから、僕だったら飲みたいときに飲んじゃいますね。
でももうちょっと詳しく答えるんだったらば。
もうちょっと詳しくね。日本酒であんまりそこ気にしないのかなとあんまり考えたことがないですね。他の人知らないけど。
On second thought, he was like, he's like, even if it was a really pure, delicate daiginjo, like a competition grade, he would drink it whenever he felt like drinking it. And I said, well, can you give a slightly more professional or a little more of a
I guess it's safe to say he doesn't often import Japanese sake to Japan, so it could be a tough question for him.
That's true.
ありがとう。
But as an importer for you, Hanukkah, I know for me, for wine, I would often try not to show things immediately after they came in. What's your feeling?
I don't feel that way with sake. I mean, I think that I do think that they can be a little disjointed right after pasteurization if it's tank pasteurized.
Sure.
And so I do find that if a sake has gone through its second tank pasteurization and then arrives in the US really quickly, I'll taste it and it might seem a little just like it needs to settle down. But for sake that's bottle pasteurized, I don't find that. So I think understanding the details of the pasteurization really helps to make that decision.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Monica, in the chat, Nina had a question with you know, perhaps sales being down. Is there an opportunity to make aged sakes, or when can you make that decision?
まあ、田中さん、
はい
例えば今年の作りの、お酒の量が多すぎる問題とかあるんだったらば、もっと古酒スタイルに寝かして、そういうお酒に作る考えもありますか？なんか、アメリカでやっぱり古酒みたい、熟成酒とか癖があるお酒が結構人気なので、そういうお酒もリハクから出てくる可能性あれば、それもいいねと思ってるみたい。
面白いと思いますけど、結局ね、日本国内で言うと、結構お酒って安いんですよね。で、古酒にして値段が上げれないと、まああんまりいいことがないので、できるだけ早く出す方が、まあ、お酒の質もリハクっぽいし、いいのかなというふうに思ってますので、まあ、早く飲んで、僕が作った時の味でみんなに楽しんでほしいなと思いますね。
でも、日本、まあ、税金関係だったら、販売するまで税金払わなくてもいいでしょ？
そうね、販売するまで払わなくていいです。はい。
So, I mean, Tanaka-san has some conflicted ideas about the koshu. I think that koshu, the image of koshu in Japan is a very high-end, you know, vintage sake, and it's not really the realm that he is so much interested in promoting, especially. And then, so either it's like come up with this marketing plan for having koshu and having this like dessert sake kind of style, or it sounds kind of like half-assed, like I have this leftover sake that's been sitting around, would you like to buy it? And so he really wants to work as hard as possible to make sure that people are going to be drinking a sake in the condition that it's meant to be drinking. Paul, any last comments?
I was just going to open it up if other people have questions, or for Monica too. You know, any questions you have about any of the cool things that we tried today. These are all 4 ones that I absolutely love, and I love sharing them, and they're so different. They pull in very different directions, and so it's a really nice assortment of things. And so if you had a question about any of the ones we tried today, feel free to ask away, either off mute or in the chat room, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I think it's really fun to go back and go through this journey one more time. I think that the rules with serving namazake is that it's always supposed to be pretty cold, right? But I actually think I really like to see how these show closer to room temperature now that we've had them open and sitting here for a little more than an hour. I mean, I think some characteristics are more pronounced. I think that they have more of an identity, each of them, as I go back and taste them. But
yeah, as I go back to the Fukucho, as it warms up, it's getting even more lactic, and it really has a very Northern Italian cheesy notes to it for sure. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I really enjoy it. I was just going to tell a little story too about the taka, which if we want to go back to that one for a moment. At the start of the year, this is a brand new bottling. I don't know. Did he do a nama before, or is this a totally new product, or just a new importation?
It's a new product. They have a summer. It's funny. They have a summer sake, like a natsuzake that I saw on social media a lot, and so which had this rainbow label, but it was a sparkling nigori. And I said, you know, I really want to do a nama, but I'm really into this idea of having the same sake in pasteurized and nama versions. I think it's just a great way to educate people, and it really makes a good argument for why we go out of our way to bring in nama when you can taste them side by side. And so he was not super excited about doing the label for a different sake with a sake that he doesn't normally do. But I really love this rainbow label, and I think it really looks like spring and summer, and it's so festive. And I wanted to experience the same sake, so it is a new product that he made for us.
Cool. And Monica's prediction when it came out was that it was going to be one of her best sellers. And indeed, everyone that tries it says it's just wonderful. So nicely done, Monica.
Thank you. I'm so glad you like it.
Yeah. I just think it's fascinating. It just has flavors to me that I don't normally pick up in sakes. And so I think it's just really interesting.
Well,
yeah.
I hope everyone has a great night. I feel pretty good after having 4 glasses of sake, and it's 7:47 here, so it's very acceptable for me to be 4 glasses in. But I don't know about you guys.
Nice.
But,
I put again in the chat because we've got a couple of the Nama left, and then some of the pasteurized versions, as you were talking about, so you can try side by side pasteurized and unpasteurized sake, which is always fun to kind of compare the two and see the differences in aroma, as you talked about, as well as the differences in texture. They can be quite different from the pasteurizations.
Amazing. Well, it's great to see everyone. I can't wait till we do more of these in person. But Paul, thank you for bringing this all together, and hopefully we can all kanpai online together in the near future.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Thank you.
So, kanpai. Thank you, Tanaka-san.
Arigatou.
ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。はい、ありがとうは。
ありがとう。
The family business.
Oh, thank you all. This was great fun. I'm so glad to have everybody join in.
Yeah, this was really special. Thank you.
Bye, Nathan.
Thank you.
See you.
この人影は何？